Everybody. I would like to begin by acknowledging that wherever we are in Australia, we live, work and play on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. My life is lived in Naarm on the lands of the peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples that may be present with us tonight. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty of this land was never ceded, and the impact of colonisation is ongoing. I spend my workdays looking out to the bay on the lands of the Bunurong, and I follow the bends of the Cororate Creek to my home on Wurundjeri country. As I walk this land today, I do so knowing that this country has been walked and cared for millennia before me, and I open myself to hear those stories, the ones full of joy, wisdom and wonder, but also those of sorrow, heartbreak and loss. I embrace the culture and wisdom of my home and walk alongside my Indigenous brothers and sisters to a more just Australia. I would like to thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Mel Brown and I'm the Community Engagement Librarian Sustainability at Hobsons Bay Libraries. And this event is being brought to you tonight by Hobsons Bay Libraries and the Enviro Centre. A quick reminder that as we transition to reopening our library branches, I would recommend anybody out there to keep checking the library website for the most up-to-date list of what branches are open and when. We've had a few open and then have to close again because of an exposure, so just keep an eye on that website and our social media pages because it is changing a little bit day to day. For tonight's event, we do welcome guests to keep their cameras on if they'd like to. Please keep in mind that we are recording, so if you don't want to be on, please, you can keep your cameras off. Microphones on mute as much as possible so we can minimise any background sound, but we've got lots of time for questions tonight, and at that time you're welcome to pop your cameras and your microphones on, and we will be turning the recording off for that Q&A with the audience tonight. So we're being joined tonight by Hannah Moloney, author of the new best-selling book, The Good Life, How to Grow a Better World. It's right here beside me. If you haven't got your hands on the book yet, I do recommend doing so. There's so much more in this than what I expected. I'm not going to talk too much about it because I know we're going to get into this conversation, but there is so much more in here than what I expected when I picked it up. Our good friends at Book and Paper, our independent bookseller in Williamstown, do have copies available for sale, and I will also pop in the chat the link to reserve the book in our library catalogue as well, so you can reserve that, one of our library copies. Now, Hannah is the director, lead landscape designer, permaculture educator and change maker at Good Life Permaculture. She has 2 decades of hands-on experience in designing, building, managing and doing projects around urban agriculture, small scale farming, permaculture and community development, all towards that goal of building climate resilience. Since 2019, she's been a guest presenter on ABC's Gardening Australia and is an ambassador for Community Gardens Australia. When she's not working on other people's gardens and farms, she's working on her own and hanging out with her goats, which we've already heard a little bit about tonight. Tonight, though, we have a special guest interviewer joining us as well. Kat Lavers, many of you know, is the Hobsons Bay City Council My Smart Garden Officer and runs the My Smart Garden program for our municipality. As well as being a permaculture educator herself, Kat and Hannah have worked together, writing a chapter for the book Reclaiming the Urban Commons, and are good friends. So I'm sure that we are all in for a very good conversation tonight. Please join me in welcoming Hannah Moloney and welcoming and handing the reins over to Kat for tonight's conversation.
Oh, thanks so much, Mel. Lovely introduction and welcome, Hannah.
Hello, so nice to be here.
I'm going to start by acknowledging that I live, work and play and also garden on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land between the Merri and the Darebin Creeks.
And I live and work on Muwinina country in Nipaluna on the base of Kunani, Mount Wellington, and it's so nice to hear the stories of where we are. Yeah.
So Hannah, you're probably most well known these days for your role on Gardening Australia, but you've been such a key person in the sustainable food movement for actually as long as I can remember. And it's a very personal book, there's lots of your stories in there. And I wanted to start by inviting you to tell us a bit more about your backstory and where you grew up. And I also wondered, was this trajectory inevitable for you? Like, were you ever tempted by any other professions or pathways?
Oh, that's good.
Thank you, Hannah,
Good question. Yeah, I guess because I grew up in Meanjin in Brisbane on an urban herb nursery, so I was very much surrounded by urban agriculture type projects. I've always known what's possible in cities. Like I've never, even though I've always wanted to farm, I've never thought I had to go to a rural area to do that. And I guess, funnily enough, when I grew up in a herb nursery, it's quite a lot of work. I think if people grew up in a farm or in the nursery kind of context, you understand it's 24/7. So as soon as I could, I just left. I was like, oh, I just don't want anything to do with that. But like after 6 months of traveling Australia and learning about different environmental and social justice issues, I ended up working on a herb nursery by choice and really loving it and realizing I had all this knowledge and skill that I had just learnt by default. So it's an interesting question. Have I always been destined for this trajectory? I think on some level, yes. The trajectory was very much about following my gut and my heart, like how do we be in this world when so much is problematic? How do we kind of live a good life amongst that? And at various times, I have definitely tried. I tried working in an office actually. It lasted 3 months. And I was working with a great council doing community development projects, but I just realised, my skill set and my character is better doing the project, not managing the paper around the project. So I think we can all relate to when you find your place in the world and how that looks like. It's hard to do anything else. So I'm very much have been, finding my way over the years, and in the past decade, I've really locked in. I'm like, yep, let's just go as deep and as hard as I can and see what happens.
Well, let's talk about going as deep and as hard as you can. So you've got your business, Good Life Permaculture, and you've got a particularly exciting home. And you're sharing that with your husband, Anton, your daughter, Frida. So what's a typical day look like for you, meshing all of those things together? Like you wake up and then what happens in Hannah's world?
Yeah, look, we do definitely cram a lot in. So I'm an early riser, so I often wake up and have some moments to myself, which is often when I exercise. I'm really into weightlifting these days, which is great for my back. But very shortly after, I'll milk my goats. I have 2 milking goats, and as summer comes on, I'll be watering and irrigating things in the vegetable garden in particular. So I can do the animals in the garden in the morning. And with our daughter, we have a 6-year-old daughter. It's quite, with little school activities on the go. So we do get her to school, and then my work is super diverse. So every day is different. The common things that might be happening is that I do have lots of landscape design projects on the go. So we have a garden office I'll be working in. I might be out on site at a farm with a client doing things or organising workshops. I am so often dreaming up projects around community and climate resilience and talking to people, meeting with people and going, oh, what could we do together? Very interested in around putting more of my energy towards climate action and community projects. And so I spend a lot of time thinking and talking with different people around that at the moment, which is fun. Yeah, so every day is different. And then in the evenings, it's more goat time, more garden time. And with Frida, our daughter, it's a lot of reading Harry Potter at the moment. It's like a significant amount of our life is about Harry Potter right now. Yeah.
Sounds like a beautiful and exhausting mix. And we should probably talk about this book, which I'll flash again in front of the camera. So, people who know you or have seen you on television, they might just go, oh, Hannah's written a gardening book. But it's so much more than that, as Mel alluded to. And the things you mentioned then, climate action and community, is just infused throughout this whole thing. So I want to give you a chance to talk in your words about what this book is about and why you felt like you had to write it right now.
Yeah, so the book answers the question, how to live a good life in the face of the climate emergency. And it's not a gardening book, although it does include a chapter on gardening, but it's much more holistic because it needs to be. If we're going to have these conversations around the climate emergency, we can't think in silos. We have to think more broadly and live more broadly. So it's very much, I've based it around my own life. I'm like, this is how we do it here. But also I include and shine the light on how other people do it in their individual lives, but also in a whole system level with different organisations and networks. I think that's important to remember. this burden, if you like, of how to solve the climate emergency doesn't sit on our shoulders. We really need to start remembering that, yeah, of course, grow your food, compost those food scraps, and let's look at our whole system here. We actually need to rebuild this thing. We need to vote in, we need to reclaim democracy, vote in responsible politicians, and do all those things. It's not one or the other, it's both. And so this book really kind of tries to bridge those gaps. And I've woven in a lot of personal insights and stories to try to, I guess, humanize the whole conversation a bit more, and remind people that this is everyone's conversation and it's everyone's story, and we all have a seat at the table to contribute. And that's what I was really trying. And I had to be a bit brave actually to share some of the things. So I was like, no, it's going to do it.
So you've got chapters in the book on your house and tips for people retrofitting their homes or even building new ones, garden, chapter on food, very delicious chapter, chapters on community and a good life for all. And I want to just go into the house and garden stuff first. And so you've got a permaculture setup where you live now. Now all sites have got challenges, as we know, but some have more than others, and yours has some really extreme challenges. So tell us what it was like when you first met your block, and some of the challenges and how you've overcome them.
Yeah, we have a really challenging block. It was the one we could afford, and we loved it. It's drenched in sunshine. It's got amazing views, and we can walk and ride to most areas in Nipaluna, Hobart. So it's really beautiful. It's also super steep, like really steep. And the only reason we could afford it is because it came with no driveway, and to access it, you used to have to walk up a 120-metre staircase through my neighbour's steep garden. And we did that for 4 years until we convinced our neighbours to let us use their driveway and buy right away. And it was just, we didn't have a daughter then. So we're just like, let's have a crack. Because people talk about good land and bad land. And I'm like, there is no such thing as bad land. There's all land is good, and I think it's about understanding that hardly any of us can buy textbook perfect land these days. It's like, well, what can we access, and how can we really make the most of that? So we've done a lot of terracing on our slopes, so we can actually walk around and manage water and nutrient flows. And these days we have vehicle bike access, and it's pumping. It's beautiful. Like, it's still a lot of work compared to a more flat block. Everything on a steep block is more expensive, it's harder, and it takes longer. And that's the reality. So things that we do with clients on a flat block, it's just so straightforward, whereas with us it's like 10 steps before we can even plant something. So we're used to that, and we understand this is the reality for so many of us. Like, most of us don't have ideal blocks, and so it's how do we just navigate that and be okay with it? Yeah, find a way.
You found so many ways there. It's an incredibly special garden. Now, even though you were less impacted than us by the pandemic over in Melbourne, I know it was still quite an unsettling time when the pandemic was breaking around March 2020. So you write a little bit in the book about that time, and I want to know, what do you remember about that time and what the community was experiencing, and how do you reckon your experience was different because you had a chance to set up a more resilient home?
Sure. Yeah, so we were so privileged that we already work from home. We've got an established garden. We already buy food in bulk, so we were stupidly prepared in a practical sense. And at the beginning of lockdown, when the whole of Australia was in lockdown, so when there was a fear was everywhere, and a lot of people coming to us locally and online just going, please help. There's no fresh food in those local shops, and I'm worried about ongoing access for fresh food in particular. And so we were, because we were so set up by default, we were freed up to help other people. And I was still running my full-time business, but I think I was volunteering full-time as well, just doing online videos and local workshops and setting up a local food share stand and just lots of associated things around that. And we felt really, I guess, clear that was the best way to spend our energy. Like, of course, this is where we should be, and how fantastic that we're able to help in this time. And I think our local food share stand is still going almost 2 years later. These are all on impacts. Yes, in Lutruwita, Tasmania, we've kind of sidestepped COVID up until now. We're about to open our borders, so we expect that to change. And also, it's been a really interesting time to have the conversations like, well, what does community resilience look like beyond your fence line, and how do we support that to happen now, not later when disaster strikes again? Because the thing about the climate emergency, they say expect more disruptions to happen. That could be COVID, or that could be floods, fires, drought. Like, we need to expect more and more disruption, and how do we prepare for that in a way which is not fueled by panic and fear, but of love, community, and joy? Like, how do we let that drive us instead? Yeah.
I did have a little giggle when I read that you did do some panic buying, but it was, I think, bike pads, brake pads for your bike, and some compost.
Yeah. We've got 2 big electric bikes here, and they chew through the brakes, and so we went and spent like $200 on brake pads. And like a mountain of compost, just so we just could stock up, and that was it.
So one of the kind of enduring legacies of this pandemic is going to be so many more of us working from home now, and I'm interested with how that fits with having a household like yours that's got crops and animals. You're obviously working from home a lot, and that was already part of your pattern. But what's the advantages, I guess, for people who are now working from home who weren't before?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people it makes it possible to have a type of garden, which might be pot plants in a balcony, or it might be something more expansive, but it might just make it possible because a lot of people beforehand spend any spare time commuting before and after work, and especially in winter it's dark when you get home, there's no time to be outside. So I often do a lot of my gardening in lunch breaks here, for example. So I'm like, I'll just go potter and do a quick weed. I couldn't do what we do here if I didn't work from home. It would just be wildly impractical. I've got 2 goats, which I don't need to check on daily, but I feel good being able to just check on them daily, like multiple times throughout the day. I couldn't have the responsibility of animals here if I wasn't here. So I think for other people, yeah, I think a lot more people will be working from home now, and it's an opportunity to go, well, what could your home be? How could it be more activated? And that might be a small or large garden, and that's a composting systems, whatever that might be. I think it's a beautiful thing to think about home being a really productive place of abundance rather than just something you do on the weekend after work. It's like, no, your home could be a real hub, and it's a lot of fun to play around with what that could look like depending on your context.
Well, let's talk about that context a bit more, because I know there'll be a lot of people out there thinking, I'm renting, I can't have goats.
Yeah.
And you do put a lot of focus in the book into opportunity solutions for people who are in a rental context. Can we talk about some of those? Like, how do you do food growing? How do you do retrofitting a home even if you don't own it?
Yeah, and I think it's so important because a lot of us won't be able to afford to buy a home ever in Australia. And before we managed to get this place, we have a mortgage, I should say, with the bank. I think I lived in 25 share houses in 10 years, and I got really good at working out how to retrofit a house to be comfortable in cool temperate Australia, and how to grow something within a 6-month period, which is quite abundant. And so with house retrofitting, like, mostly it's about how to keep warm in old ramshackled houses and in rental houses. And so we do things like we'd insulate your hot water cylinder. If it was sitting outside, we'd wrap it up with this insulation blanket, which we do here as well. You can make your own pelmets, which sit above. You can put curtains on your windows and put pelmets. You can make them out of old cardboard boxes, and we still do it now. Actually, with our kitchen, we make what's called a hot box, where if you're cooking rice or some veggie stew, bring it to the boil, and then you put it in a basically wrap it up in blankets in a box and cover it, and to let it finish cooking its own heat. And there's all these little hacks which cost no or very, very little money. Actually, maybe no money. I think that's a really key thing. We have to make sure when we're talking about climate solutions, they have to be climate solutions for everybody, not just people with privilege or access to different resources or money. It's almost useless to talk about that. It's like we have to talk about it for everybody. And that I keep coming back to, yeah, we have a great life, a really good life here, but how do we make sure everyone has a good life? And that's why I do try to emphasize accessibility. And when we talk about gardening, it could be gardening in pots or gardening in a straw bale. gardening in a sack, things that you can carry around with you, whatever that might be, because it has to be accessible. Some people don't even have earth, or in cities, the earth that we do have might be contaminated, so you can't grow in it, or you're not sure about it. So that we have to make sure that we start normalising solutions for every context. Yeah.
So for people who are talking really, really small scale, they can only squeeze in a couple of pots onto a balcony, or they just don't have much capacity to have anything beyond that. What would be your tips for the most productive plants to be growing in a really small?
I think in tiny spaces, think salad greens and think herbs. They're really great and delicious, and they're quite expensive at the shops. And so, and that can include growing sprouts on your kitchen sink, which you don't need any earth pot plants, no soil for. That's a really simple thing you can use with brown lentils, just rinsing in a glass jar and draining them. With a few days, you have really nutritious and delicious salad green, like sprouts for your salad. And then, but yeah, in pots, I'll grow lettuces. I grow, oregano, thyme, rosemary, whatever your favourite herbs are. And of course, in summertime, you could have a crack at some basil and coriander as well. But things that you like eating is a really important thing. So don't just grow it because, Hannah said to grow coriander. But if you hate eating coriander, don't bother. So, just choose what is really practical and good for you, especially if you've got tiny space. You really want to make sure you maximise it in the biggest possible way.
And a lot of people will be thinking, wow, that just sounds like a lot of hard work and a lot of time. And I actually remember you telling me once about a time that you decided to forgo having an annual veggie patch because life was very full and very busy. And I wonder if you could tell people your conclusion after living without a veggie patch.
That's right. I can't remember. I think we were doing some house renovations over a season, and my partner Ant and I were doing everything ourselves and working and all the things. Like, look, let's put our annual garden to bed for one season so we can just not go crazy. And we did that. And it was so inconvenient because you have to go to the shops all the time. And I don't know if we're just really unorganized, but it was just, we actually ended up eating not as well as we usually would, like less greens, less vegetables. I was like, oh, this is actually super inconvenient, quite expensive when you're trying to eat really well and good quality things. And I've never done that again. I was like, no, even though gardening is definitely work, you don't want to just pretend it's not work. Of course it's work, but it's infinitely more convenient for me just to wander out and pick my salads or my veggies than it is to try to remember to go to the shop and get something which is not too expensive and decent quality. It's a really fascinating thing. I was not expecting that. I was expecting a rest and to go, I'm just going to take a break. I'm like, that was so inconvenient.
Now in the chapter on food, I looked at it, I was like, it's a little gold mine of all Hannah's favourite recipes. So you do go into some recipes. Can you tempt us with some of your favourites that are in?
I think a big one for me is like what to do with bulk produce that we get from our garden. So I'll make a lot of kimchi, especially in winter and spring, and we're just wrapping that up now, but lots of Swedes and carrots and garlic kind of kimchi mix, which is beautiful. And we do, like, yogurt's a staple, like, because we have dairy goats, we're very lucky that we can just keep that going. So I talk about yogurt making and little things like how to make veggie stock, so because we do have lots of veggie scraps here, as we create them, we'll pop them in a little bag or container and put them in our freezer. So after a week or 3, we can then make a big veggie stock pot. Like, I've tried to concentrate on recipes which can eliminate waste or kind of transition surplus produce into a new product like kimchi or yogurt. So the recipes are go-to things about how to prevent food waste and create really tasty, delicious things.
All right, let's move away from gardening now, because it's so much more than gardening in the book. And I know for you, Hannah, growing community has always been at least as important as growing plants and growing animals. But many people in the city now don't know their neighbours at all, or only know one or two. So have you got tips on how to break into your neighbourhood and start meeting people, for the people who want to, because not everyone does want to do that, but
it's important.
Tips on getting to know your neighbours and neighbours.
I think it's great they acknowledge it, because some of us are more introverted, and the thought of like meeting your neighbours is slightly terrifying. And that's cool, no worries, respect to all the introverts out there. if you're really quite interested in like actively building community, like I think the best way that I have found is to create different types of events, and events can be really simple and really easy to organise. It might be a cup of tea where you invite 5 households. It could be a street party. It might be a composting project. It could be a food swap. I happen to do quite a lot of community events because I'm interested in bringing people together, and I'm an introvert, but I can kind of surpass that by going, oh, I'm more interested in what I could do here, which is not about me. And I'm good. My coping mechanism has been, if I just organise people to come together, and then it's not about me, it's about everybody, which is cool. And I think skill sharing is the other big thing that I've had so much fun with. Like, so we'll do skill shares around, you know, food or gardening or building, composting, and that's a winner, because it's a gold mine of people just sharing knowledge and skill, and it's fun. So I think it depends a bit on your interest and your skill set, and of course your you know, your community. What makes sense there? What are people interested in? So yeah, think about that. Do a bit of an audit of your community and see, yeah, what are people interested in? What's the need? Like, what are people looking for there? And that can be like you're into doing things. And then I think once things start happening and relationships start building, it just keeps rolling on, and it feeds itself to a certain degree.
I like the way you talk about doing an audit there. And another thing that you talk about auditing in the book is your values, which is interesting because so many people don't really stop to think about values in a detailed way, let alone try and write them down or articulate them. So can you talk about what your values are, why it's important to know them?
Yeah, I think that's because a lot of people ask me, oh, Hannah, what should I be doing in my life to be, you know, more, you know, effective, or live a more meaningful life? I'm like, oh, just articulate your values. You can just do that anywhere. You don't need anything. It's just you and your brain and your heart, you know. And the reason why I really emphasize that is because I really believe it's probably one of the most radical things we can do, because it flies in the face of how we are told to live, even if that's just subconsciously. And when I say that, I mean, like, you know, when we're born into this world, people say, welcome, yay, you're here. Here is the system, please perpetuate it. And that's the expectation. And when we invite ourselves to reflect on your personal values, I reckon I can guarantee it that it will start to have some tension with our system, because our system does not foster a regenerative, healthy, just way of life. Yeah. So I think if people took some time, and I reckon you already know what they are, even if you don't know what the words are around them. Like for me, for example, some of mine are love, authenticity, joy, justice, community, connections. These are big umbrella statements that a lot can fit within. And these are the things that, like, they're kind of like my checkpoints, you know. Am I living my life? Am I helping these come to life, these values, or am I starting to compromise on them? And if I'm compromising on them, I'm like, okay, wrong path, got to step back, you know. And I am far from perfect in living them, but the point is that you're having a crack, and that's the cool thing. I think we've got to stop trying to aim for perfection and just start trying to do things. So I'm a big fan of values. So I've got a section in the book about inviting people to start questioning what their own might be, and to write them down, and then to think about what would your life look like if you lived by them. I think that's a really beautiful thing to ask of ourselves. Yeah.
I agree. And I imagine that for many of us, when we do articulate those values, they are going to lead us towards more climate action in our life. Yeah. You write in particular about justice for First Nations people and supporting them as a very key step towards climate action. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, and also some of the personal actions that you've taken in that space?
Yeah, sure thing. So, there's so many things to talk about. When we talk about climate solutions, it's important that we centre First Nations voices in that. It's by default, sometimes what's happened over the years is that well-meaning, usually white people come in and go, here's some climate solutions, technology or community, whatever that might be. But it's not, when we centre First Nations lived experience of being on the front line of climate impacts in Australia, along with other frontline communities, and we learn from their lived experience. I think the solutions will be not necessarily completely different, but they might be reframed, more accessible, more affordable, and have justice, with something called climate justice at its heart. And climate justice is making sure that we see the climate emergency not just as an environmental thing we have to fix. It acknowledges all the intersections between social, environmental, economic, and more intersections that come about. So we have so much to learn from our First Nations people in Australia, and I think the more that we place them in the centre of the climate solutions, the more it will benefit everybody. And I think we have nothing to lose when we do this, and we have everything to gain. And I think I keep saying that because sometimes there's pushback going, oh, but we just got to, we just got to charge forward and, keep going with our current system and do this different version of capitalism and, all these different things. Like, actually, we can't keep going on this infinite growth model. It's not going to work. Why? We have so much more to gain here if we just step into, yes, the unknown, but we'll create something so much more beautiful, more functional, more just, if we just try to trust that a bit more and do a huge amount of work. And I think the other thing I say here is, this is multi-generational work. We're not going to solve everything in our own lifetimes. And that's really helped my brain, because people have been working on this for generations before us, and they'll be working on it generations after us. And what we can do while we're here is keep pushing that forward, that conversation, and keep pushing that movement forward so it progresses as much as possible, and then hand the baton on to the next people. So I think, that's a very long-winded answer.
And some of the personal actions that you're taking around that.
Oh, yes. So with First Nations in mind in particular, we do a few things. So we do something called Pay the Rent, where it's actually a whole movement which encourages people to put some financial contribution towards a First Nations organisation of your choice. So we do that with the local Tasmanian Aboriginal Corporation, and we give a monthly donation, and there's no strings attached. And that's really important detail, because it's about honouring self-determination when so much of that has been taken away over the past 200 years and still is so compromised. And so we just want to support you to do what you need to do. And that's a really, it's so easy for us to do that. That's the easiest thing. I just don't understand why we don't all do that. And it acknowledges that we're living on unceded land as well, which is, again, so important. And another thing we do, we are also a paying member of a national climate action fund called Groundswell Giving. And that's when we fund climate action, we're funding First Nations solidarity support projects usually, because climate action, good climate action is centred around working with frontline communities, and that's, as First Nations people will always be there. So we're a paying member of that as well. Again, if you have surplus cash, it's one of the easiest things you can do. And the third ongoing, more complex thing I do is I do a lot of self-education around First Nations in Australia, but also globally, around racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism. All these things have quite strong intersections. And, I'm, as a white Australian settler origin, there's some uncomfortable things to think about. And that's fine. It doesn't mean these things aren't comfortable to think about, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't think about them. And so it's an ongoing, I think it's a lifelong process of just going, how can we keep breaking down these patterns that we've inherited, and how can we create new, healthier patterns of being together? Yeah.
So as well as talking about your path and your values in the book, you've also got a lot of case studies in there, other projects and people that align with the values that are doing amazing stuff and contributing to these causes all around Australia. I wanted to give you a chance to tell us about some of the other people that you featured in your book.
Oh, fantastic. I'm just going to pick up my book to remind me. But I really wanted to highlight, because our place is so particular and so unique, I just wanted to make sure people could see other radically different contexts and people doing things beautifully in their own unique ways. And, I've got some people in there who are living in a house truck, and it's run off vegetable oil, and they traveling musicians and artists. And that's a really nice thing when you think about what is a beautiful home. A home could be anything, I've got some people living in rental houses, growing mushrooms and selling them commercially as well as for them own selves. I've got, you know, people growing tiny gardens around townhouses and then more expansive gardens and farms as well. There's so many things. Gosh, I can't even remember what I wrote. Yeah. Then do you want to talk about the whole system change at the organisations that I've highlighted?
Sure, give us some examples.
Yeah, I think I really wanted to make sure that people, I talked about it earlier, but we don't just focus on our individual lives and our individual actions, but we contribute to the whole system change as well. So with that in mind, I included some kind of climate positive initiatives addressing climate emergency, including organisations like the Fire Sticks Alliance, who are a First Nations organisation who basically educate people about cultural burning, also known as cool burning, and they're working with amazing fire services and educators around Australia to really integrate that in a meaningful way about how do we manage our land and how do we manage that holistically on large tracts. And that's really, you know, I think in Australia fire is a huge part of the conversation, and when we can blend that with cultural healing and cultural practice, that is an incredibly powerful thing. So I really want to shine a light on them. And of course, some people in Victoria might know of Hepburn Wind, and so they're more of a regional project doing incredible stuff around energy and community building and resilience. Like, they're kicking huge goals. Like, oh my God, check them out if you haven't already. And one I really love about, also from Victoria, go Victoria, by the way, is around democracy, and it's called Voices for Indi, and it's getting a lot more traction around that now, I've noticed in the media, which is so good. But it's around communities coming together to elect their representatives and then support them to get elected, ideally. And then when they're in government, work with them as volunteers to support them around being a politician. And it's a beautiful way of disrupting the current system, reclaiming democracy, and really creating politics for the people, by the people. So I think what I tried to do in that chapter is highlight different sections, like First Nations, democracy, money, and like energy, all the things, food systems, because just to highlight that things are already happening, the solutions are already here. We just need to support them, replicate them, get in behind them, join in, basically. But that's a really heartening thing to remember.
It is, and it's just such a sort of a feast of inspirational ideas, the book, and there's so many threads to follow up when you've had a flick through it. And I'm thinking that a lot of us will look through it and go yes to everything, but what do I do first? So what would you say to people who love it all but are just needing one place to start?
Sure, I'd say check in with your values. That's like point one, do that. And I think next one after that is checking with your community, and that might be one other household, or it could be something a bit more expansive. But I think the more we can think about community resilience in the climate emergency, is the better. It is so important. I mentioned, disruptions are predicted to be more and more in our lifetime. And I really believe having those local connections, those local relationships and local systems around the basic needs that you can meet them within your community, and you can look after each other. And I think that's so important. And within that is food, water, shelter, energy. There's quite a lot of things in there. And I think that will be tailored. It has to be tailored for each community. And I don't say this to scare people. I say it to go, hey, this is an amazingly incredible time to be alive. Opportunities everywhere. Let's make this a really fantastic experience. Yeah.
and some of that, some of the disruptions and the challenges that we're facing in the future, the knowledge, expanding awareness around climate change also does come tinged with grief for many people. And you end the book by talking about this concept of radical hope with a lovely quote from Rebecca Solnit. And I wanted to ask you, what is radical hope and what does it mean for you in the context of the emergency that we're going through?
Yeah, so radical hope is an active term, and in the face of the climate emergency, it's about having hope in the face of huge uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen, and we do everything we can, knowing that it may not work, but we do it anyway because of the chance that it just might. And importantly, this is not just a naive optimism. It is what we call like is love and courage and action. And that's what really drives me and my partner Anton, because it is devastating to look at the science and to look at our political and industry leadership. Doesn't look good. And so how do we navigate this without falling into a heap? Yeah, and radical hope is definitely something I hold on to tightly. It gives me huge joy to go, wow, we could just change the course of history here. And I really believe we will, because we have to, by coming together and working together and joining in on, I think, one of the most remarkable times to be alive. So radical hope is definitely a core thing that I hold on to. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you one more question, Hannah, which is, what is your radical hope for your book, The Good Life?
Ooh, well, it is. Oh, look, I hope that it reaches everybody that it needs to reach. I've had so much overwhelming feedback where people going, oh, I've been in such a dark place around the climate emergency. Your book's helped me turn the corner. Gee, what else could I hope for? That was my hope when I wrote it, my intention. I went, okay, we need more positive stories. We need to change the doom and gloom narrative to one of hope and opportunity. And that's what I wrote the book for. And it's just the best to hear that it's actually helping people and working. Yeah.
Well, it's a deeply personal book, but it's also a very practical, hands-on book that's told so much warmth and grace and love, and I would expect nothing less from you, Hannah Moloney. It is to you, and I think we will turn it over now to questions from the group who are participating tonight, but thank you from me personally.
Thanks, mate. Thank you.
Thank you to Hannah and Kate for that, Kat, sorry, for that amazing conversation. You can see the respect and the love that you two have for each other when you're having that conversation. So it was really lovely to be a part and to be able to watch that beautiful connection when we're talking about connection and community. There's some of the links that we all need to go out and make. I am going to pop the recording off, so I want to say goodbye to everybody who is watching this later, and check out the Hobsons Bay Libraries page for our upcoming events. So bye for now.